Welcome to Warsaw. My name is Dr. Frank Henker-Stefani. I have been working as a scientist on nicotine and alternative products for many years. I'm here at the Global Forum on Nicotine, the best place in the world to talk about tobacco harm reduction and a very good place to meet the community and experts. I'm looking forward to interesting talks. Yes, I'm very pleased to be joined by Michael Minton. You are working for an independent think tank, Reason, who is looking for unintended consequences of legislation in the United States. And if you think back at the conference, what do you think is the most relevant area for misled legislation, regulation in the harm reduction and tobacco field?
Honestly, I think it's the vulnerable populations that continue to get ignored, and vulnerable populations within a given country, but also around the world. We have, from the United States, and we kind of have this penchant for when we make a policy in the United States, we kind of like to export it to the rest of the world. So, for example, in the United States, smoking rates are pretty low now, under 10%, I think, among adults. But we recently had a pretty big uptick in youth vaping. And so that's a big issue, especially among the more affluent white populations in America, where we still do have a much higher smoking rate among, for example, indigenous people. I think the rates are still like 30% smoking, which is huge. But our policies focused on, frankly, what the wealthy white parents are concerned about, people who tend to donate to politicians. And so they're worried about their affluent white teenagers. But we've now exported that policy to the rest of the world, where smoking or vaping uptake is very low sometimes, in India, for example, but you still have an enormous percentage of the population smoking, which is a far riskier behavior.
In the United States, I think harm reduction is a big issue because, as you said, the prevalence of smoking was declined. What do you think is the main reason for this development?
Why I think smoking has declined a lot, at least in the United States, is primarily education and the existence of alternatives. Because I think, I said this on stage at one point, we didn't have to convince people to stop using asbestos as a way to insulate homes. Once there was knowledge that it was dangerous and an alternative option, people moved to that naturally. People were already moving to tobacco harm reduction products naturally all around the world, really depending. We have snus and e-cigarettes, and people, once they understood, in the United States, for example, there's plenty of knowledge that smoking is dangerous. So when e-cigarettes came around, most people who weren't already well into their smoking careers switched to that.
Yeah.
And we've just made it harder with policies aimed at specifically, at least on their face, aimed at protecting youth from easy access to these products, youth who don't already smoke. And we try and say would never have smoked, which is a very difficult thing to predict if a kid would never smoke. So we're taking this option away from them and making it much more difficult for adults. So we're seeing the numbers kind of, plateau.
Yes, but I don't think you can take it for granted. In Germany, for example, everybody knows smoking is dangerous, but we have an official communication on vaping products where they are not harmless, where they are dangerous, where they emit formaldehyde, which is carcinogenic, there is no safe level. And at the end, more than 60% of people believe that vaping products are as dangerous as cigarettes or even more dangerous. And I think it's quite a good progress in the United States that the official communication at least seems to make the difference quite clear to the general population about differential risk. And I think it's quite some kind of impressive progress, which we do not have in Europe, unfortunately.
Yeah, we're in the United States. I think it's just that the evidence is too difficult to pretend that you don't see anymore, that tobacco harm reduction products are safer. So activists and consumers of these products have really pushed federal agencies and representatives of those agencies to stop using language that has convinced so many Americans that, 10 years ago, the average American adult was more well-informed about the relative risks of tobacco harm reduction than they are today, because of so much misinformation.
Yeah.
And a lot of that did come from our government, but more recently it's been coming from outside of the government. The government has kind of allowed these other groups that have almost, in the public perception, like American Heart Association, American Lung Association, people think of them as if they are government agencies, and they get away with saying things that are just factually incorrect and misinforming the public. And we see this in the data too, scaring adult smokers away from safer products, which is just, malfeasance, in my opinion. To allow that, as the government, to allow that misinformation to continue to spread.
In recent publications like Global State of Harm Reduction, there was much critique on some American campaigns for tobacco-free kids, which were accused really to spread misinformation. But if I understand correctly, people are now starting really to differentiate information and really to take up scientific, factual-based information and adapt behavior accordingly.
I hope you're right. I don't see, as an American, I still see a lot of those organizations, Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, for example. Oftentimes they're not exactly lying. They're just emphasizing information in order to be scary. And in their minds, what they're doing is scaring people away from a not optimal option, right?
Yes.
For them, the optimal option is abstinence, is no nicotine whatsoever, regardless of the actual risks or possibility of that for a lot of people being able to quit nicotine. Speaking of vulnerable populations, they very rarely consider for the people who actually do get demonstrable benefits from the use of nicotine. People have mood issues, mood dysregulation and things like that. Perhaps they could be put on a different type of medication, but we very rarely even ask, is that better? Is a prescription medication better for some of these people than nicotine? And the reason we don't know is because we just don't study that very much. We don't study what the benefits are. And part of that is because groups like Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids who lose their minds if you even try and study benefits of something like nicotine, because their whole thing as prohibitionists, as abstinence pushers, is you can never say a thing positive about this because the public will misinterpret that. Honestly, they really do still seem to treat the public as if they have no level of sophistication, that any subtlety in messaging would just convince huge swaths of people that it's okay to do something dangerous.
Yes, but I found your response in the morning to the keynote of Professor Pahl very impressive, because you raised some examples which are really not straightforward.
Yeah, whenever you look into the literature, for example, like I mentioned on stage, that we have a policy in the United States where if you're in public housing and government-assisted housing, there is no vaping or smoking allowed. And, that is, for somebody who is experiencing something like houselessness, especially if you're a parent, houselessness and stress and economic stress and all of this comes with a greater urge to smoke. You get into public housing, that doesn't mean you instantly lose the desire to smoke, and some people may be kicked out of public housing or deterred from applying in the first place from public housing, which at the end of the day, you're like, maybe that does convince a few people to quit smoking, and that's wonderful. But for the people that it doesn't work on, the effects can be enormous and extremely damaging. Of course, the positive effects of the people who they convince to quit are quite large as well, but it can be absolutely devastating, and it's cumulative too, where you have a tax policy that requires you to spend more of your limited income on this thing, and then you're stigmatized by your community. You can't really talk about it,
Yes.
Because people will be like, you should just quit, you'll get that. And so I find smokers tend to be extremely reactive when you ask them about their smoking habit, and that's due to years of campaigns getting family members to hector each other into trying to quit. So they're very closed, they're very reticent to even talk about it, which makes reaching that population more difficult, unfortunately. And then you have the added stress and the potential loss of housing stability.
Do you think at the current stage we would need to define specific rights for smokers?
I can see some help from that, but generally I would say I think all of public health needs to respect human rights, period. Whether you're a smoker or a drug user or whatever it is you're doing, that includes respect for people's autonomy, instead of just saying, you have a disease, therefore you're not making your own choices, so we can do whatever we want to help you make a better choice. That's unacceptable, and it leads to a lot of really bad behavior and poor treatment of people and thinking about people in a bad way, which leads to bad policy. Frankly, like when you have people in the room who at the core of their heart think of drug users or people who smoke or people who use nicotine as lesser than, that allows them to contemplate and then implement policies that violate, in medicine and public health, what should be fundamental human rights is non-coercion, policies of non-coercion.
Yes, fundamental human rights sounds like a celebration speech, but I think it's correct. And I also think that it should also include rights for users of alternative to have access to the best attainable option. And therefore, I'm quite impressed that in the United States you granted modified risk status to snus. You accept vaping products, but I think you make everything very, very complicated with the FDA application forms.
The American political system is very smart in that it learned its lessons from alcohol prohibition, and that we have learned as a general population politically that you can't really say we're going to prohibit something most of the time and get away with it. So instead we implement, layer after layer after layer of regulation that functionally makes it impossible. We're an enormous country, huge country, and you have a federal government. FDA they don't exactly want to regulate 1 million different tiny companies. They would prefer a small number of companies they can work with, which is what they've done, not through legislation exactly, just through regulation by making the regulation so expensive and difficult that it weeds out every application, every company, until you're left with 23 products out of 2 million applications. Is it workable? It is for certain very large companies, but at the end of the day, and this is something policymakers rarely think about, they're thinking about, we don't want to regulate so many companies, we really just want to deal with a small number of products and a small number of companies. At the end of the day, that's giving enormous power to those companies, those individuals, and we don't often think about down the road what that's going to do in terms of what kind of products are they going to release, what type of innovation are they going to pursue. Because when we had a more open market prior to the FDA regulating tobacco, the innovation in the e-cigarette market and other, non-combustible products was enormous and fast. And it was honestly a lot of the times driven by the consumers themselves saying, this is what I want, making their own modifications, their own flavors, and then companies would respond to it. That's sort of dead stopping now a little bit because competition is much lower. It's a workable system for some, but it could be better. It could be far better.
But if you would to give a prediction for the perspective of nicotine products in the US and in Europe and in general, what would you, how would you expect things to develop?
Well, I'm an optimist, so I generally think the science is so clear at this point, and it's so important, what we're dealing with in terms of we still have so many smokers in the world who are very likely to die, extremely likely to die from that particular habit. I think it's just getting too difficult for the people who would like to be prohibitionists, who would like to, prescribe, exercise 5 days a week and, never, only 1 glass of alcohol a day at most, or 4 a week, whatever it is. They would love to do this, but I think there is some recognition that it's not possible to police people's behavior in that way. So I would hope there's a little bit of a loosening up. I do worry that prohibitionist drive is going to be displaced onto other drug users. We're already seeing a little bit of that conversation and rhetoric beginning to escalate in the United States, a little bit drug war rhetoric is what we would call it, fire and brimstone. You're immoral for using drugs. And unfortunately, those are the same politicians who are the only politicians who would come out in defense of nicotine products. So I'm optimistic in that the science is so clear, and when I see countries like the Philippines and others reconsidering bans and going their own way from what the WHO is telling them to do. And I think actually just this is good and bad, but the general pushback against the World Health Organization is positive in a way that will allow countries to address their population's needs as they are instead of what an external entity, thousands of miles away is telling them they ought to do.
Do you think you will sign FCTC and ratify it at some time?
The United States?
Yes.
I honestly don't know. I couldn't say. I couldn't predict that one.
Okay, but that's an honest answer.
Yeah.
And it was really, really nice and interesting to talk to you. I hope we have further opportunity for exchange at the conference. And I would like to thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you for having me.